Okay, hi everybody. As you can see, I've got my Nerf Stampede Project Rampage open again because we're having an issue. I've fully charged the 12-volt battery pack for the first time the other day, and I put it back in, went to show it to a friend, pulled the trigger, and we got continuous firing even though I'd released the trigger. Now, many of you will probably be familiar with this problem. Now, normally it's down to a little spring in here. Let me just get some better light. Now, this problem is commonly attributed to that little firing catch control spring in there, which sometimes pops out of place and causes the piston to just be constantly released so that it never actually closes. Every time the motor goes back, it just carries on going forwards again. Now, this is commonly shown by finding your spring looking like that when you open the gun up, popped out of place, or like that, sticking out through the gap. Now, I've opened mine up and found the spring to be perfectly fine, still in position. So what this means is that the motor is outrunning the return spring. Just grab something to point here. That's the return spring, that kind of loose spring that you can see through the window on the gun when you're pulling the trigger. Now, the main actuator gear in there is about 2/3 covered in teeth, which interact with the teeth here on the piston. Now, the idea being that, well, let's just start by establishing that this piece here, when you pull the trigger, moves down like that, and it actually pushes a switch in here which engages the motor to start the whole firing process. Now, you pull the trigger, that moves that, pushes the switch, starts the motor. This is going to be quite difficult to do one-handed. Okay, so you've pulled the trigger, the motor has started spinning, the teeth have engaged on the bottom of the piston, it goes forward. Now you see that the trigger is released, but a slider on the piston keeps the motor switch engaged, so that just one little pull of the trigger starts the motor going forward, and the slider on the piston keeps the motor engaged to complete the firing mechanism, so that the mechanism goes forwards, and normally the piston wouldn't be released. I've just released it so I can actually push it forwards, but the piston goes all the way forwards, collects the dart on its way through, breaches it, and then when the piston gets to a certain point, just here, it engages this slider, which is the trigger control switch, or the piston release catch, whatever slider, and it pushes that and releases the piston, which shoots forward, firing the main piston and launching the dart. Now, the teeth on that main actuator gear are enough so that the 2/3 will slide the piston forwards, and then when it gets all the way forwards, the smooth part of the actuator gear will be like shown to the piston. So at that stage, those teeth release and the return spring pushes the whole mechanism back, and you see that when it actually gets back, the slider releases the motor mechanism so that it stops firing. Now, if you've got the trigger pulled like that, for say full auto firing, the motor will just carry on going. So you pull the trigger, it goes forward, fires, goes back. If you've got the trigger pulled, it just carries on going, just keeps going like that. Now, the problem that we've got from me upping the voltage on this is that the motor is spinning faster. So what's actually happening is it gets to this point, the smooth part of the gear is shown, the piston starts going back, but because the motor is spinning faster, the teeth on the actuator gear re-engage the bottom of the piston before it's got all the way back and released that motor switch. So it just keeps doing that, just keeps firing over and over again. It gets far enough back to actually reset the piston, but not far enough to release the motor switch. So it just carries on firing, and you actually have to turn it off or take the batteries out, or sometimes it stops firing when you run out of darts because the loader there isn't dragging over more darts in the clip, so it goes back a bit faster, just a little bit faster, just enough to disengage the motor. So I'm trying to figure out what I need to do to make it so that that motor switch is disengaged every time the motor gets back to the reset position. I'm considering just removing that piece of plastic altogether so that the gun will only complete the firing mechanism as long as the piston, the trigger is held down. It becomes independent of whether the piston goes all the way back or not. It does mean that for a single shot you'd have to time your holding of the trigger quite well, and I'm worried that that will mess up the timing of the gears on here. I don't want the gears to constantly be engaged on that. Requires a bit of thought. Yeah, I just kind of gave up on the video for a bit. Had a bit of a brainstorm. Posted this massive thread on Nerf SG's forum, or SG Nerf, whatever you want to call him. Anyway, it's pretty awesome. He showed me how to do the battery tray mod with the the quick release catches, those things. Yeah, that was pretty cool. Yeah, I haven't done anything about that spring because I don't think it's going to pop out. If it was going to, it would have done by now. Anyway, the source of the problem. The source of the problem, regardless of whether it's your spring or your piston catch thing or the piston seal, whatever, the source of the problem was this armature not being released by the piston, so it just continued to be pressed down with not a long enough release to actually turn the motor off. So what I've done is cut the tiny piece of plastic off of the top of this that would normally be engaged by the slider on the piston assembly. So now the motor activation is solely controlled by you pulling the trigger. If you want to fire a single shot, you have to hold the trigger long enough for a single shot to be fired. I'm going to see how it goes. Okay, it seems to work. For anyone who hasn't seen it, this is the internals of my gun. The fan's not hooked up at the minute. I haven't plugged in that little blue connector just there. I've got the Molex going to the key switch here. Blah 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 blah. Blue LEDs in the breech. EL wire. That's the inverter just there, and we have the safety switch now does the laser, yeah, which is powered by a 5V LM7805 voltage regulator in there next to the inverter for the EL wire. Yeah, anyway, see if I can get a clip in here with one hand. This has got 3 rounds in. Before, even with it open like this, one pull of the trigger would just empty all 3 rounds. Now, you see, fires 1 round and then the spring winds it back again, but it doesn't kind of entirely disengage it. I mean, it fires, and then the spring kind of does the rest. But it works. I mean, look, you can do that. If you pull the trigger and release it, it stops and winds back a little bit. Could be annoying for some people, but if you're good with your trigger pulls, it does do a full reset. See, that has gone all the way back and none of the teeth are engaged. But I'm really happy with that. Seems to have solved the auto firing problem. You just have to be a little bit more careful. Alright, I'll put it all back together, see how it goes. Oh, don't you just love having to screw these things back together, clamp everything in place, and then look at your map of where all the bloody screws go. Yeah. My wrist is gonna hurt after this.